In the beginning of our study of Genesis, we saw four great events. Creation, God's formation of the universe, earth, and all of life, including humanity. We saw the fall, humanity's disobedience in the Garden of Eden, introducing sin and brokenness into the world. The flood, God's judgment through a global flood, yet preserving Noah and his family as a new beginning. And then the Tower of Babel, humanity's attempt to unify and elevate themselves, leading to God's intervention by confusing their languages and dispersing the nations. But from chapters 12 through 50 are four great people: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and Joseph. And throughout all of this, through what we end up today, we will have covered 2,400 years of history. That's from the young earth creationist perspective, 2,400 years. And here in the last few verses of chapter 49 and all of chapter 50, we put a conclusion on the book of Genesis as we talk about the death and burial of Jacob and then the death of Joseph. At the end of chapter 49, where we left off, Jacob has just pronounced a blessing on his 12 sons, a prophetic blessing of what would happen with their descendants. He's on his deathbed, surrounded by his sons in the land of Egypt. And we're going to see both Jacob and Joseph exhibiting great faith at the end of their lives and even in death. Both of them finishing well. That's our title this morning. And we begin by noticing a faith-filled farewell. A faith-filled farewell. We're in chapter 49, verse 29. Then he charged them and said to them, this being Jacob, and he said, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. So even though Jacob was in Egypt, and he's now lived in Egypt the last 17 years of his life, Jacob was not an Egyptian. He was a son of the promise, an heir of the covenant that God had made with Abraham and with Isaac and himself, and now it's been passed on to his 12 sons. So Jacob asked to be buried in the land that was promised by covenant. And he gives clear and specific instructions to be buried in the cave of Machpelah, where his grandfather Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, his father, and Rebekah, and Jacob's first wife, Leah, were buried. His wife Rachel was buried in Bethlehem, somewhere else, but Leah was buried there as well. And here he says, bury me there. It's a statement of faith that ties him to the promises of God, even in death. It's to say, hey, that's the land God gave us. Canaan is the land that God promised to me and to my father Isaac and to my grandfather Abraham. And then verse 33, and when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So this is the death of the last of the patriarchs, yet the plan of God will not end when Jacob died. When he dies, God's redemptive plan would continue through his sons and the generations to come. And Jacob dies in faith. He's trusting God to continue his plan through his descendants. We continue on, verse 1 of chapter 50. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. This is a moving and dramatic scene. Joseph's response shows that even godly people grieve deeply. Grieving is not a lack of faith. Joseph believed in the promises of God, but he still mourns the loss of his father. The last of the three great patriarchs of Israel has now died, and in tribute to Jacob and really Joseph as the great son of Jacob who rescued Egypt and the whole region from catastrophic death because of the famine and all of Joseph's role. Well, verse 3 says, the Egyptians mourned him 70 days. This is a remarkable response because in ancient Egypt, when a pharaoh died, they would mourn for 72 days. So for Jacob, this outsider, to receive 70 days of officially recognized national mourning shows what a greatly honored man that he was. So Jacob dies, and because of Joseph's position, he gets the highest state funeral possible, and they mourn him just 2 days less than they would a pharaoh. I mean, think about Jacob. Remember back when he was running around Padan Aram trying to find a wife, and then running from his brother-in-law Laban, and all the things that he had to go through. Did he ever think he'd have a funeral like this? I seriously doubt it. But notice, Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. Now, why not just cremate his body? You know, the Bible doesn't give any specific teaching about cremation. The Old Testament law does not forbid it, nor does it attach any curse or judgment on someone who is cremated. However, you will never read of that method of disposing of the body in Scripture. The Egyptians didn't do it that way. The Hebrews didn't do it that way. And the reason Jacob wanted to go back is because it was a statement of faith for him. It was to say, not this land, that land is in the land that is in the land of promise. I believe the future generations will inherit in that land. Plant me in that land. That was his statement of faith. Plant me in that land where we are going to go back to. And when it comes to Christian burial, the language of the New Testament is such that it speaks of burying the body. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 43. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. Paul uses the metaphor of a seed being planted and growing to illustrate the concept of resurrection. The physical body, when it dies, it's described as being sown in dishonor due to its physical decay and mortality. However, in the resurrection, the body is transformed and raised in glory with the same body, but with a spiritual, immortal life. So the idea of sowing a body in the ground is the statement of faith. It's saying, I'm planting a seed and it will be raised in glory. I believe in a future resurrection. And that's why you never find a record of the Hebrew people disposing of the body in cremation. You do find it in many pagan cultures. In fact, in early America, there was not cremation until much later, and the reason it started, for back then, their purpose, it was many of the rationalists and atheists did it as a fist in the face of God, as to say, it doesn't matter, it's just a body, get rid of the body. That's not true today. Today, it's more a matter of, well, cost and space. I mean, you know, you drive through some of these small towns in Texas, and in downtown, there's a massive cemetery, and you're like, well, it's full. I mean, where are they continuing to bury all these bodies? And there's practical reasons for it today. But that's just a historic perspective. The Bible does not prohibit cremation. And as far as the resurrection of the body, if a body has been cremated, that doesn't make it any more difficult for God to resurrect that body. The bodies of Christians who died 1,000 years ago have by now completely turned to dust as well. So this in no way prevents God from being able to resurrect their bodies. God created our bodies, and he will have no difficulty recreating them. God is able to raise a person's remains that have been cremated as easily as the remains of a person who has not been cremated. So this question of burial or cremation would fall into the category of being a realm of Christian freedom, where we have a decision to make and we're free to choose either one. But the statement of faith that's being addressed here is simply, I am sown in dishonor, but I believe in a future resurrection. So there is a New Testament principle to what Paul talks about of being planted. Continuing on, verse 4. Now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am dying. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. Joseph didn't make this initial request directly to Pharaoh, but he spoke to the household of Pharaoh. And Joseph relates to Pharaoh through Pharaoh's household that his father made him swear that he would be buried back in Canaan. It's an explanation for why he would be given permission to leave the land of Egypt. And not only to leave the land of Egypt, but to do this work of honoring his father and have the time off to travel and to bury his father. And Pharaoh gave him the liberty to keep that promise that he made. Verse 7, so Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones, their flocks, and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. Understand, it has been 39 years since Joseph has seen the land of Canaan. 39 years. Verse 9, and there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. Then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a deep mourning of the Egyptians. Therefore its name was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. I mean, what a scene. The entire family is accompanied by many of the servants of Pharaoh and the elders of Pharaoh's house. They all went together in this grand procession to pay tribute to the last patriarch. And it says in verse 10, they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. Again, it's okay to mourn and to grieve. Christians don't grieve as those without hope, but we still grieve. We still mourn the loss of loved ones. We're to honor those who go before us. It is holy to honor your family. But there is hope on the other side of the weeping and the mourning. But grieving is just part of the process. And we see that happening here with Joseph and all of the family. Verse 12, so his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial place. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who went up with him to bury his father. Jacob had commanded that his sons take this solemn oath that they would, in fact, bury him in the land of Canaan, in this specific place, the cave of the field of Machpelah. Now, when you consider how Jacob's sons had often opposed him and lied to him and disappointed him in his life, it makes sense as why he commanded them to make sure they followed through with his final wishes. But they were careful to do so. They honored him in his death. And so they buried him in the cave, purchased by Abraham, which this is the only part of the land of Canaan that Abraham actually held a title deed to. Everything else was by promise, but he held the title deed to this specific piece of land. And Jacob was gathered to his fathers, both in burial in this world and in the afterlife. He was gathered to his fathers in the afterlife. And his faith-filled farewell shows that Jacob finished well. His final words reflect a lifetime of being shaped by God's grace. And we're all being shaped by God's grace. And he's doing a work in each of us. Finishing well starts long before the end. And don't wait until the end to get serious about your faith. Grow now. Take take the lessons, the life lessons that God is working in your life here and now, the way he's trying to shape you. Live today in light of God's eternal covenant, not on just your temporary circumstances. So that's what we see first. And next we see grace-filled forgiveness, beginning of verse 15. Grace-filled forgiveness. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him." Now that their father has passed, Joseph's brothers feared that Joseph would seize the opportunity to take revenge on them. And knowing human nature, that was certainly possible. Back in Genesis chapter 27, Esau vowed to hold back revenge against his brother Jacob until their father died. The idea was that once Jacob and Esau's father died, then Esau would take revenge against Jacob. So maybe the same would be carried out here by Joseph against his brothers. That's why the brothers said, he may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. Notice, they acknowledge, they admit what they did was evil. They admit that what they did against Joseph was evil. So the truth is, what the brothers worried about was justice. They were worried about justice. They feared the righteous retribution that Joseph might bring against them now with his high status and prestige in Egypt. Joseph was certainly capable of bringing this retribution about. He had the power to do it, and now that Jacob was dead, well, maybe he would. So these brothers fear, their fear was not completely unfounded. And so instead of waiting for Joseph to come to them in revenge, they're going to go to Joseph. But notice how they do it, verse 16. So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father.'" They didn't have the courage to face Joseph themselves, so they sent word to Joseph through these messengers saying, "Listen to what your father commanded before he died." We have no evidence whatsoever that this story was true, that Jacob actually had a conversation with these brothers before he died. This is likely made up. This is a made-up story, which is what fear does. Fear leads to preservation, and lying can stem from that so easily. But because of the evil they had done against Joseph, they didn't feel they had the moral right to ask Joseph for forgiveness and mercy. Their guilt, their conscience was still weighing on them. So they put this fictional request for mercy in the mouth of their deceased father, and they did it through messengers. And when the messengers brought this made-up request from Jacob from beyond the grave, verse 17 finishes off, "And Joseph wept when they spoke to him." Joseph was brought to tears. Why? Well, first, because the brothers wouldn't come to him in person, face to face, but also after all this time with them, after all he had done for them, Joseph realizes that his brothers thought so little of him. To think that now Joseph has the opportunity that he'd take revenge against them. Ultimately, they doubted his character. And this relates to our relationship with Jesus. Knowing that Jesus is rich in mercy and grace for us as believers, that should make us want to come freely, openly, and quickly to our Savior and to confess our sins. Because we know the heart of God, because we know the heart of Jesus, that we can come to him when we mess up, when we fall short, that we quickly and openly do that. But these brothers doubted that Joseph would show grace, mercy, and forgiveness towards them. So they didn't come personally, and they sent messengers in fear. They had the go-between. Understand, Jesus is not like what the brothers feared Joseph to be. For that matter, Joseph wasn't like what they feared him to be. But Jesus will graciously receive his children, his repentant people, as we come to him. So we are to not be fearful, but to go to him personally. So after the messengers had sent this word, and Joseph wept, then his brothers came personally. Verse 18, then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. So they back up their plea for mercy with what I believe is a genuine display of humility. They were very willing to humble themselves before Joseph. Of course, their act of humility here showed how great their fear was that Joseph would take revenge against them for the evil they had done. But now we come to one of the most remarkable sections in the entire book of Genesis. And I realize that's saying a lot because we've had a lot of those moments. This book is filled with many remarkable sections. But beginning in verse 19, Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save a many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph's initial response is to ease their fears, do not be afraid, and then to assure them, am I in the place of God? He understood that it wasn't his job to bring retribution upon his brothers. It wasn't his job to withhold forgiveness. And when people sin against us in great ways, it isn't our job to bring retribution against them. That's the place of God. It isn't our job to withhold forgiveness from them. That's between them and the Lord. If God chose to punish Joseph's brothers, then the Lord was going to have to find an instrument other than Joseph because he wasn't going to do it. And listen, from a human perspective, Joseph had the right to bring retribution against them. He had the ability to bring retribution against them. But he knew God was God and he was not. Such retribution was God's place, not his. Retribution is God's place, not ours. And he understood that. And then he adds this at verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Now, Joseph, he doesn't gloss over the wrong things that they had done against him. He's straightforward. He's very clear. You meant evil against me. He calls it like it is. That was the truth. But there was a greater truth. The greater truth is what he says next. God meant it for good. And that was the second reason Joseph could truthfully assure his brothers that he wouldn't take revenge against them. He's saying, even though you meant this evil against me, God meant it for good. And as Christians, we need to be able to see the overarching and overruling hand of God in our lives. To know that no matter what evil people bring against us, God can use it for good. Understand, this verse here, this is essentially the Old Testament version of what Paul would write 1,900 years later in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Yet it's true that many people today have the text of Romans 8:28 in the Bible that they possess. They don't have the truth of it in their heart. But though Joseph didn't have it, he didn't have this Romans 8:28 in his Bible. It hadn't been written yet. He had the truth of it in his heart. He knew the overarching principle of God and what God could bring about no matter what we are going through. And the liberating truth is that our lives are ultimately not in the hands of men, not in the hands of godly men, nor in the hands of wicked men. Our lives are ultimately in the hands of God, who overrules all things for his glory. That means no human can derail the plan of God for your life. It's in God's hands. And he works all things together for good. Now, in one thing by itself, in isolation, may be just incomprehensible and seem unredeemable. But God doesn't take just one thing in isolation. No, it says he works all things together. He brings all of these individual things together for good. Trust God's sovereignty. Forgive because you have been forgiven. What someone meant for harm, God can redeem for good, even your own past. Don't let past guilt keep you from receiving present grace in your life. When we trust in God's sovereignty, we can let go of fear and extend real forgiveness, even to those who have hurt us deeply. Those words, God meant it for good, that's not denial. It's not glossing it over. That is deep trust in the character and the providence of God. That God meant it for good. The same God who brought Jacob home, the same God who preserved Joseph through betrayal and brokenness, and the same God who brought life through death is still writing your story. And he's not finished. So if you're sitting there, I don't know how this is going to end. No, we don't know, but God is working it all together for good for those who love the Lord. There's a story of the old minister who carried an old bookmark in his Bible. It was woven in silk threads into this motto, but the back of it, and you've seen the bookmarks, right, where in the back of a woven bookmark, there's all the threads that are tied, there's knots, and it's all tangled, and it looks weird on the backside. And he would take that bookmark out and he would show the person, whoever he was ministering to, that side of the bookmark and ask them to make sense of it. And they never could. And then the pastor would turn it over and show them on the front the white letters that were on the dark backdrop that said, God is love. When events in your life seem tangled and like a meaningless mess, it's because we only see one side of what's going on. We only see one side of the tapestry that God is weaving in your life. God is weaving something in your life. We don't see it. Maybe later after the fact we might see it, but God is working. All things work together for good to those who love God. And God had an ultimate good to work through all of this. But there was also an immediate good that Joseph could recognize there in verse 20. He said God did this to save many people alive. That was the immediate good to come out of the wrong that was done to Joseph. If Jacob's large family didn't come to Egypt to live, then the family would have perished in the famine. Or they would have, if the family had stayed and maybe barely survived, well, they would have probably been assimilated into all the Canaanite tribes around them. It was only by coming to Egypt that this family of Jacob, these descendants of Israel, could be preserved and then grow into a distinct nation. In fact, there's this chain of events that occur. David Gusick, in his commentary, he notes this. I wanted to share this with you just so you can see all of the things that happen in this chain of events. If Joseph's brothers never sold him to the Midianites, then Joseph would never have gone to Egypt. If he had never gone to Egypt, he would never have been sold to Potiphar. If Joseph was never sold to Potiphar, Potiphar's wife would never have falsely accused him of rape. If Potiphar's wife never falsely accused him of rape, then Joseph would never have been put in prison. If he was never put in prison, he would never have met the baker and the butler of Pharaoh. And if he never met the baker and the butler of Pharaoh, he would have never interpreted their dreams. And if he never interpreted their dreams, he would have never interpreted Pharaoh's dream. If Joseph never interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he never would have become prime minister or second in command in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And if Joseph never became prime minister, he never would have wisely prepared for the terrible famine to come. And if he never wisely prepared for the terrible famine, then his family back in Canaan would have died in the famine along with countless others. And if Joseph and his family back in Canaan died in the famine, then the Messiah would not have come from a dead family. And if Jesus never came, if the Messiah did not come forth, then Jesus never came. And if Jesus never came, we're all dead in our sins and without hope in the world. Do you see how all of this works towards and points towards Jesus? And I know there's somebody in here thinking, well, he could have done it some other way. Yeah, probably. He would have done it. But you know what? He did it this way. And he used this chain of events to do it. Aren't you grateful for God's great and wise plan? There's a chain of events that God has guided all the way back to the time of Joseph, and even before that, culminating in the arrival of Jesus Christ, his great work in the world, and the continuation of God's plan in the world ever since. And even though the brothers had an evil purpose, Joseph could see that God had a good purpose and a divine purpose that he was working out through all of it. Now, knowing all this, Joseph, verse 21, comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Because Joseph trusted the overarching hand of God working even through all the evil that had come upon him through his brothers, Joseph was able to show them love and compassion. And oftentimes the problem that we find in loving others and in gaining freedom from bitterness against them, it's really a problem of not knowing who God is and not trusting him to be who he says he is and to do the things that he will do. It comes back to our relationship with God and who we believe God to be. And Joseph, he goes beyond extending forgiveness, love, and compassion. Verse 21, I will provide for you and for your little ones. His love was shown not only in his feelings, he wept. His love was shown not only in his words, where he spoke to them, but his love was shown in his actions. He provided for his brothers and their families, and that provision was proof of his love. So let's not be content to merely love in feelings or to merely love in our words, but to also love others in practical action. Well, this brings us now to the death of Joseph, and we see here forward-looking hope. Forward-looking hope, verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So 54 years after Jacob dies, Joseph dies. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, long enough to see Ephraim's children to the third generation. Joseph lived a life with a lot of hardship. He had a lot that he went through, but that didn't diminish God's ultimate blessing to him. He also lived the last years of his life fully faithful to God and with forward-looking hope, as he tells his family there in verse 24, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. Again, reinforcing the covenant. Humanly speaking, Joseph was the man most responsible for bringing this family into Egypt. Yet he knew Egypt was not their resting place. They would eventually head back to Canaan, the land promised to Abraham by covenant. And his final words are prophetic. He believed in God's plan, even when he wouldn't live to see it. That's faith that sees beyond Egypt into God's ultimate deliverance. Joseph dies still trusting God's promises. That's a life well lived. To die still trusting God's promises. And his bones would eventually go with the nation of Israel in the Exodus, fulfilling prophecy. And here in verse 26, it says, Joseph's body was embalmed, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, according to this passage, and also in Hebrews chapter 11, even though Joseph's body was embalmed and put into a coffin, Joseph was not buried. His coffin laid above ground for everyone to see for over 400 years until he was taken back to Canaan. His coffin was on display as a witness to the truth that Israel was going back to Canaan, just as God had said. And of all the things that could be said about Joseph and his life and in the faith that he demonstrated, Here's how he is remembered in the hall of faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, we'll consider the hall of faith. Here's how he is remembered. Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. That was real faith because it truly trusted God's promise to his people to take them back to Canaan. It was real faith because he knew where God's people belonged, and even though they would live in Egypt for a long time, they didn't truly belong there. They belonged back in the land promised to them by covenant, and that's where they belong. So this statement by Joseph is full of faith because it looked to the future, even though that would be over 400 years away. And this statement was full of faith because it proclaimed God's faithful promise in any way possible. It's as if Joseph is saying, hey, if I can proclaim God's faithfulness through my dead bones and my unburied coffin, then let's do it that way. That was his witness. That was his testimony. Carry up my bones from here. This promise was fulfilled 400 years later when Israel left Egypt. We see that in Exodus chapter 13, verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. And we see this fulfilled in the book of Joshua. Joshua 24, verse 32, the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem. They buried his bones in the promised land. He was finally laid to rest. But think about this. During those 400 years when Joseph's coffin laid unburied in Egypt, when maybe a kid would walk by, a child would walk by and saw Joseph's coffin and ask, why is it here? What's this about? Why is this still here? The child would be answered, well, because Joseph wanted to be buried in the promised land that God would one day lead us to. He's waiting. His bones are waiting to be buried there. It was a powerful vision of great faith. You know, faith doesn't die with us. It gets passed on. And listen, some promises of God take a long time to fulfill. This was a promise, it was going to take over 400 years to fulfill, but the promise was still true. It was no less true just because it took a long time. And maybe, I pray that's an encouragement to you this morning. If you're waiting on God's promise to be fulfilled in your life, if there's some promise from God that you're holding on to, don't weary in the waiting. In His time and in His way, God will bring that to pass. Joseph had a forward-looking faith, or forward-looking hope in the promises of God. Even in death, he wanted to be part of the Exodus, and he was. Understand, finishing well isn't about, or just about, what you leave behind. It's what you pass forward, what you pass ahead. Live and lead in a way that helps others trust in God even after you're gone. To think eternally minded, beyond your time. Joseph died looking forward to God's unfolding plan of redemption, and that's where the book of Genesis ends. The book of beginnings ends with that. It concludes looking forward to the continuation of God's eternal, loving, and wise plan of the ages. In some sense, it culminates in Jesus Christ, yet takes his person and work and continues far beyond his earthly ministry. And the book of Genesis closes with a promise. God will visit you. You're going to leave this place. Someone's going to come and deliver you, and that would be Moses. But ultimately, it would be Jesus. God will visit you. Emmanuel, God with us. God will visit you. And Jesus did come to visit us and live his life perfectly among us and to die on a cross for us. So we've seen in this whole study, we've seen the beginning of creation, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of marriage, the beginning of sin, the beginning of God's plan to rescue people from sin, and the beginning of a nation, the nation of Israel. And God, in Genesis begins with life and it ends with death. In Hebrews 11, referring to the patriarchs and all of the Old Testament saints, it says that all died in faith, not having received the promise. But they looked forward, they looked for the place that God had prepared for them. They knew, they believed that God had prepared a place for them that would outlast this life. Do you believe that? Do you have a relationship with God through the Lord Jesus Christ? Because God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus is saying they're still around. They're alive. Hebrews 11, you have the cloud of witnesses. They're alive. There's an afterlife. They still exist. And every one of us will live forever. Every human being will live forever. Where you live forever is dependent upon whether you trust in Jesus Christ. God sent his son, Jesus. God made it easy for us. He did all the work. He sent his son who did all the work on the cross for us. Trust him. Believe in the Lord, and you will be saved. Let's bow our heads in prayer together.